Good morning, everybody. It's Sharon Avery from the Toronto Foundation. As you enter the room, please feel free to open up your chat and greet the room. I hope everyone is staying in and warm on this gray morning. We are going to get started. It's Sharon Avery from the Toronto Foundation. We're going to get started in about a minute. I'm just welcoming everyone into the room, welcoming you to start greeting everyone in the chat and get comfortable. The poll is open as per usual. You know the drill. Those of you that have been here before, just keeping track of who's joining us this morning and making sure that we have a good mix of folks to talk about our issue today, which is mental health and COVID-19. So we're going to get started right at 8 o'clock. So make yourselves comfortable and good morning. While you're joining us, I invite you to put in chat how you're feeling today. This is a conversation on mental health and COVID-19. One word, how's everyone doing? We'll be interested to know your state of mind as you join us. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds. So I think we'll get started. The room is filling up. We had a very large registration for today's conversation, and I think it's partly because of the topic, certainly because of the guests that have joined us today. I'm Sharon Avery from the Toronto Foundation, and I've missed you. It's been 2 weeks since our last webinar. We've moved to a bi-weekly approach. And I think it's partly because we're on a really long journey together and we realize we better pace ourselves. And I think that that's part of what this conversation is about today and how challenging this time has been, particularly from a mental health standpoint. And so I'm so glad to see such interest in this topic. And we're really delighted. I'm going to introduce Kwame, Robert, Charlene, and Kaitlyn very soon. But just a bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned, the poll is open. We'd love to know who's here. We welcome the folks in the chat to communicate with each other. If a question comes up, we will be capturing them. But if there's someone that has the answer, feel free to jump in. I've asked everyone to, as they join the room, to just tell us how they're doing today. A word or two about your mental health today, and because that is our topic. We love seeing the greetings and the connections that are made through this. I'd like to, of course, take a moment to express our gratitude to be working and living on the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. It's really important, I think, for us to acknowledge here that there's plenty of data to show the lower mental health rates among Indigenous communities and some very compelling research linking the colonial trauma suffered by older generations and mental challenges that get passed down through multiple generations in the residents of our city and our communities. And when we talk about mental health, we can't ignore the First Peoples, and they are an example of one of the very vulnerable populations facing unequal health stress through this crisis. 6 months ago, we knew that Toronto, by several measures, was the least happy city in the country. When we look back at our 2019 vital signs report, and other data from CAMH, I just wanted to share a few important data points with you. In any given year, 1 in 5 Canadians experience a mental illness or addiction problem. Canadians in the lowest group are 3 to 4 times more likely than those in the highest income group to report poor to fair mental health. And mental illness is a leading cause of disability in Canada. In Toronto, emergency room visits for mental health were increasing extremely rapidly among young adults, as were hospitalizations for eating disorders. Students were reporting higher rates of severe psychological distress, and children's mental health centers were at their limits with wait lists of over a year. Pre-COVID, CAMH was already sounding the alarm in the country that was in the grips of a mental health crisis. Canadian governments at all levels have recognized that mental health struggles amidst the pandemic. Through 211, the City of Toronto has promoted the social service supports available. And headlines from international major media outlets forecast a shadow or echo pandemic, or as the Globe and Mail put it, a mental health tsunami. You know, I have to speak personally, as someone who has not personally struggled with any severe mental health issues in the past. This has been a really challenging time. I think juggling, supporting our teams, many high-performing staff members, and their challenges through this time, juggling my own family. I have a daughter who in the past has struggled with anxiety. We were really worried that it would come up again. Now we've been lucky so far. And I have an 8-year-old son who sometimes wakes up in tears and he doesn't know why. And I think, you know, that is nothing compared to what vulnerable Torontonians who were already battling mental health issues prior to this pandemic must be dealing with. And I think when we talk about this pandemic touching everyone, there's no question that on the mental health front, this is real. So in that context, I'm going to bring our guests into this conversation. Those of you that have been on this webinar before know that you may ask a question at any time in the chat, and our team is capturing them. So we invite you to do so. And as I said earlier, if you do have some expertise in this area or you have an answer to a question that comes up, we invite you to answer it as well. And but we will be collecting questions throughout this conversation. This is a tight agenda this morning. We have 4 wonderful speakers who have generously given us an hour of their day. These folks are all busy, and I just want to speak to my appreciation for them being a part of this conversation. We're going to start talking about mental health at a higher level, around mental health inequality in this city. And joining me for this conversation is one of my favorite people, Kwame, who is the Director of Health Equity at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and the CEO of the Wellesley Institute. Welcome, Kwame. Can you, oh, don't forget to turn your microphone on. And while you're doing that, I will say, can you start by painting a picture for us of the impact of COVID-19 is having on mental health in this city, and with a focus on who's most vulnerable? We're still not hearing you, Kwame. We've lost your mic. Do you want to jump out and come back in, Kwame, and refresh your link? And maybe then I'll come back to you and we'll jump to Robert, if that's okay.
Sure.
Oh. Okay, Robert. We're going to let Kwame reorganize his audio and we'll come back to him. Robert is the Executive Director of the Distress Centers of Greater Toronto. And I know you've been busy, Robert, there's no question. Can you give me a before and after of your organization? What were distress centers doing before COVID? And then what is your day-to-day look like now?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. So prior to COVID, Distress Centers of Greater Toronto was actually finalizing a merger between Distress Centers of Toronto and Spectre Community Support Services of Peel. And so we anticipated during the month of March, we are going to continue to harmonize our services, but of course then COVID hit. So Distress Centers of Greater Toronto, of course, provides emotional support services to those people who need it. We run both inbound and outbound programs and in-person support programs. So we have 4 sites. We're emergency responders, volunteer responders come and respond to inbound calls. And we also have programs where volunteer facilitators support people who've experienced suicide or loss through suicide or homicide. And prior to COVID, we probably had maybe 300 calls per day coming in, and we were placing 175 outbound calls, and we're supporting about 60 people in-person, one-on-one support programs, and running 4 or 5 groups of about 10 people each in our suicide and homicide support programs. And of course, our main driver is the 500 active volunteers we use to provide peer-to-peer support for both callers and program participants. So that was the before. We were very much a physical centric organization, relied on physical space in order to provide support. And then COVID hit, and we almost right away realized that many volunteers were anxious about coming into the 4 sites because of all the directives to stay home. We're considered an essential service, and we had to find a way to provide the same level of support during COVID that we did prior to COVID. So what we did is we equipped our volunteers to respond to calls remotely. So right now we have about 200 volunteers who are able to take calls remotely. We still have a few volunteers coming into the office to take calls. But just to give you an order of magnitude, prior to COVID, we might have taken fewer than 10% of calls remotely and 90% through our 4 sites. And during COVID, that would completely have switched. So 90% of our calls are being taken remotely, and 10% are still provided by people working at the sites. We have staff jumping in to provide support to volunteers much more frequently than we have in the past, just to fill in gaps in coverage. And then overall, we're probably seeing a 20 to 30% increase in call volume and inbound lines. That didn't happen right away. The first couple of weeks, we saw volumes that were not inconsistent with those that were prior to COVID, but it seems to be on the upward trajectory now. And so our helplines are experiencing greater volume, but we've been able to stabilize helpline support. And our survivor support programs, the homicide and suicide survivor support programs, are up and running virtually, and both one-on-one sessions and group sessions. So, 6 weeks in, we've I think done a really nice job of stabilizing our support to people who rely on us.
Are you seeing any noticeable differences in who's using the services right now, Robert, or who are you most worried about through this?
Well, interestingly, we have a lot of repeat callers who call distress centers, but we've noticed, especially in the city of Toronto, that we've seen quite an increase in new callers. So we've had in the last couple of weeks a 53% increase in new callers. That's huge for us. It's a very unusual spike in activity. And then, when we look at why people are calling, we've seen an over 30% increase in people reporting issues related to abuse and violence. We've seen a huge increase, over 60%, in people talking about concerns about unemployment. We've seen about a 35% increase in people expressing concerns around substance abuse and addictions, and a 20% increase in people with suicidal thoughts. So all of those are concerning to us.
Normally, you would refer people to a more tailored service. What does that look like in today's COVID environment?
So when we refer, I think it would be more proper to say that when we try to educate our callers about the options available to them to better help them in dealing with whatever their area of concern was, and we're running into a number of issues. They range from people who don't have a computer, so they're not able to do everything that's now online and access virtual services. We're dealing with people who are afraid to leave their house, who are afraid to take public transit. So accessibility is a real issue. We've certainly seen an increase in people who have relied on counseling, in-person counseling prior to COVID, who are really missing that counseling once COVID hits. And then we're also seeing people who are reporting, especially in our suicide and homicide support programs, people who are commenting on, in the homicide support program, the fact that trials have been stalled, and they're not getting a sense of closure they otherwise would have if those went forward. We're hearing about people who are experiencing more substantial issues because of the restrictions on funerals, the restrictions on religious gatherings. The typical supports that people rely on have changed.
Okay, I'm going to see if Kwame's audio is working.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yay. Okay.
I apologize.
That's okay.
I'm sorry, everybody online. I'm sorry, Mike. You were sort of catapulted into being first when you were expecting to be second, but did a great job, and I'm sorry for the technical problems.
No problem. Thank you, Robert, for that. And Kwame, so my initial question for you was, paint a picture for us of the impact of COVID-19 is having on mental health in the city as a whole, and then particularly on those most vulnerable.
I think Robert did a great job in explaining what's going on. I mean, obviously, COVID-19 has a significant impact on mental health and mental illness. This is a stressful time, and stress increases mental health problems. And as Sharon said off the top, some people are saying we're having an echo epidemic of mental health problems. But on top of that, one of the things that's happening is that COVID-19 is amplifying existing problems with mental health. We were already in the middle of a mental health epidemic, and now things are worse, but also social problems and the social determinants of health and the inequalities seem to be being exaggerated. At a high level, there are 4 types of impact of COVID on mental health. The first is the impacts of the disease itself and the fear of the disease. For instance, the fear of COVID has led to increased amounts of anxiety in the population. And then the disease itself has a significant mortality. Over 3,000 people died in Canada, but died in circumstances which are different, where there's not it's not possible to see them, it's not possible to grieve properly. And so those are the sorts of impacts. There are lots of impacts of the disease, but that's one impact. Second, there's the impacts of the public health response itself. So physical distancing and social isolation have led to more family arguments, depression in some people. We're seeing more substance misuse, and also more people withdrawing from substances because they haven't got access. And when you put families together in tight spaces with what we found, which is an increased number of people drinking more alcohol and feeling stressed and frustrated, you get more family arguments, you get more domestic violence. So there are things like that that are going on which are due to the public health response. And then one of the things that you started to get at, Sharon, was that there are impacts. The third impact is the impacts of the medical response. And what I mean by the medical response is that we've moved towards more emergency working. Fewer people are seeing people face to face. And so people with mental health problems actually are having difficulty accessing appointments. And we're also finding that people aren't going to the emergency department as much, and we've got an increased risk of suicide, which we're seeing come through as well. But then the last and the fourth is the impacts of the financial downturn. And we know that financial insecurity is linked to increased rates of depression and anxiety, and unemployment is linked to suicide. So all of these things, the impacts of the disease, the impacts of the public health response, the impacts of the changes in the medical system, and then the impacts of the financial downturn mean that we can predict, and we are already seeing, more mental health problems and more distress and more stress in society in general. And I think, as Robert said, with the distress centres, they're already seeing it coming through, not initially, not in the honeymoon period, but after 2 or 3 weeks, it's ramping up.
We were talking about this yesterday as a team around this so-called honeymoon period and the long tail that this conversation. I mean, I could imagine us having this conversation a year from now and still dealing with the outcomes. Thinking about equality, Kwame, and the factors of race, gender, age, which populations do we need to focus on when it comes to supporting mental health in COVID?
I think that we know that many people who already have mental health problems and are going to have particular issues with COVID-19. There's a small section of people who may find it easier if you say, for instance, you are an agoraphobic, you don't like going out, then sort of actually the world's turned around to help you in some ways. But that's a small proportion of people. Most people will find this incredibly stressful, and people with mental health problems are going to be at increased risk. But I also think that, though it's complex, if we were going to, because mental health is complex and there are lots of different illnesses and different problems, people with serious mental health problems, I'm very worried about at the moment, because we know that people with sort of chronic problems such as schizophrenia are more likely to have chronic illnesses, and also people are more likely to be living in congregate living situations, so living in group homes and things like that. And if you put together living in group homes, which increases your chance of getting the disease, and then the fact that people with long-term illnesses like schizophrenia are more likely to have both diabetes and also heart and lung problems, then they're at real risk of serious consequences of COVID-19. But other populations we know are at risk of infection and are also at risk of the mental health problems that go with it. So during H1N1, the influenza pandemic, the Southeast Asian population were actually 3 times likely, the South Asian population 6 times more likely, and the Black population were 10 times more likely to be infected. 20% of deaths in H1N1 were in the Indigenous population. And as you know, in the USA at the moment, and in the UK, the Black population are twice as likely to get COVID, and also twice as likely to die. And we don't know whether the same thing's happening here. But populations who believe that they're at risk and know that they're at risk of infection is a marker also of poverty and other things that are going to make them more likely to have the negative effects of this COVID pandemic due to overcrowding, due to not having enough money to put food on the table, due to being essential workers and not being able to social distance. It is. I was speaking just recently to a family who was a woman, a female-led family, who was a personal support worker. So she was the breadwinner, and she was going into areas without personal protective sort of equipment, personal protective equipment, because they weren't giving them out to the personal support workers in that area. And she had a very real choice to make of going to work and then possibly putting herself and her family at risk, or putting food on the table. Because if she decided to resign from work, then she wouldn't get the benefits because she'd resigned. And you can imagine that the stress that all of us are feeling gets multiplied over and over again when we see what some of the first responders and some of the essentials workers are having to deal with. And you can understand how that leads to mental health problems, not just with her, but with her family.
Thank you, Kwame. I think that's actually a perfect segue to Charlene. Charlene Avalos is the manager of Holistic Healing Services at Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. And Charlene, I know you have been on the front lines for 30 years. And I can't imagine that the story Kwame just told isn't one that you've heard in some form or another. And before I get you to answer that, we better just get you to talk a little bit about Native Child and Family Services. This is one of my favorite, just for those in the room, this is one of my favorite organizations, an institution in Toronto that tends to fly under the radar, but does important work. And so maybe you could just tell us a little bit about Native Child before and today, and then let's go into that question, Charlene, about what you're seeing in the counseling work you're doing. Don't forget, don't forget to unmute.
Good morning, everybody. You can hear me? Okay. Yeah, I think before we start, I would like to say that Native Child started 30 years ago with 4 frontline workers in response to a number of issues faced by our community. And over the years, it's grown to have over 250 people working for the organization. But we started off as a healing, as a treatment, as a preventative agency. And in the early 2000s, we became the 4th mandated Children's Aid Society in Toronto. So we have a balance of, and we have the privilege and the opportunity to work with children and families who are involved in the child welfare system, but to create a circle of care for those individuals and to help them move through their difficulties. So our services do not only service child welfare involved individuals, but we work with children, teens, adults, families, and the community in general. We have a number of different services and programs. I oversee 4 different teams. But before I get into what those teams do, I think it's important for me to outline philosophically what our underpinnings are when it comes to mental health. I think we take a different approach. We look at it from the Indigenous worldview, where mental health is seen as part of a holistic frame. It's based on the medicine wheel, and it's understanding that in order to have mental health, you need to have balance in all 4 quadrants of the medicine wheel, including the spiritual, the mental, the emotional, and the physical. So when we look at mental health, we have to look at those 4 quadrants and understand how that impacts well-being and health of individuals, families, and communities. We also see mental health as being a relational thing, that it's not only an individual situation or a problem, but it becomes a family and a community problem because we're all interrelated. And so our approach at Native Child has always been to take a relational approach to working with our community members that's based on honoring where they're at and understanding the impact that colonization has had and the intergenerational trauma that most of our community members carry. They may not have gone to residential schools themselves, but their grandparents or their parents have. And those, the intergenerational trauma has carried on. So those things are very important for us to consider when we work with our families and with our community members. I personally oversee 4 teams. I oversee intake, our original talking circles, which is our really a traditional way of addressing issues within families where everybody has a chance to speak and talk, and it's led by an elder. I oversee the VAWs, developmental service, our anti-human trafficking program, our concurrent case managers, our school board clinicians, our therapists who work with children, teens, and adults and families. And I also oversee our Healing Lodge, which was newly established this year for women and children women who are impacted by trauma, addictions, and mental health, and their children. And it's to bring families together. And it's a 4-month program where the women and children work and live together on a healing, in a healing modality. At present, we have 5 women in the lodge and 6 children, 4 of which are under the age of 4. So it's been quite a challenge to keep that going, but I'll talk a little bit more about how we're moving through that with COVID. So I guess to talk about how COVID has impacted our families, well, I think it's been mentioned already, socioeconomic conditions have, really have an impact on people's mental health and well-being. And we found a real increase in the need for basic human needs. And in response to that, Native Child has created a hamper system and a referral process that's centralized for our community if they need food. And to date, I think it's probably as of last week, we had delivered 600 food hampers, and it's probably up to 700 now. In those food hampers, we have food, basic food and needs. And, people are allowed to ask for what it is they need and want. We have food cards, Walmart cards. We have the medicines, the 4 medicines for spiritual reasons. People want to smudge. They want to use the medicine. So we give out those medicines. And we also have harm reduction kits, because I think, as been mentioned previously, not only have mental health rates increased, but the increase in addictions has increased, and we're seeing that. So we're really concerned about people and going to safe injection sites and not having the proper wear to go to those sites. So we're sending out harm reduction kits for individuals that need it. We've also moved to opening up a new house, a transition house for youth who are homeless. Because we're finding a real increase in homelessness. People can't surf coach anymore. So we've put people up at the new transition house, but we also have people who we've put up in hotels because they have nowhere else to go. We've seen an increase in family violence because people are living in very close quarters. And if, the lateral violence, the family violence is increasing. We're also seeing a lot of distress for our women who are involved in sex trafficking because they're not being engaged in that as much, and their pimps are putting a lot of pressure on them. So that's been a spike. We found increase in anxiety and depression across the board. Families with children who have developmental issues or special needs are really struggling because they don't have the respite care and services that they had in the past.
Can I jump in?
Yes,
Charlene,
yeah.
because I think when you first came in the room before we started the webinar, I asked how everyone was doing. And I am not surprised that your answer was exhaustion. When I hear of those spikes, I guess really in sort of a quick last question before I move to Kaitlyn, how are you keeping your staff and your own energy up through a time like this?
I think that we have the real honor and the privilege to have a very, very strong cultural program at Native Child. And I think like every day we have our elder and traditional teachers come on and say a prayer for us. throughout the whole process, there's been drum circles. Native Child has a culture night that's being zoomed in for the community. And I think that's really what's gotten me through. I think just having that whole spiritual perspective, and also the community, the way that we're reaching out to each other through Zoom, through telephone. I mean, all the therapists that work on my teams are meeting with their families, their community members via primarily phone, but we also have a number of things posted on our base camp, cultural resources, resources for children, things to do for parents. And so that's been really helpful. And I think Native Child, the first week that we were into the COVID situation, got up on Zoom, and we've been Zooming ever since. And we're just getting better and better at it. And again, it's that relational perspective. We're keeping in touch with each other. We're supporting each other, not only as individuals and as colleagues, but as a community. The community's reaching out in a way that I've never seen it reach out before.
Well, it's beautiful to hear, and we're so grateful to you for that. So we're going to come back, but first our last speaker, and then we're going to have our questions, is Kaitlyn. Kaitlyn Axelrod is leading the programming and outreach at Sheena's Place, and Kaitlyn's been up early this morning. She's already been on Metro Morning. So thank you for making us your second stop this morning, Kaitlyn. So again, the first question I would just ask you briefly to answer: what is Sheena's Place before COVID, and what is it looking like today?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sheena,
and I'll just remind Charlene to mute herself, just because we're getting a bit of background noise. There we go.
Thanks. So yeah, Sheena's Place is a community mental health charity. We support people affected by eating disorders. So that includes people with their own lived experience and also caregivers and loved ones. So we do that through providing group-based support. So we typically, prior to COVID, provide more than 20 groups per week that cover a variety of different topics, all led by mental health professionals, including myself. All of our programs are free of charge, and clients self-refer, meaning they don't need any kind of diagnosis or referral, which is very, very rare in the eating disorder world. Diagnoses do serve as a big barrier to support and treatment for many people. So we are the only organization in the GTA that provides such low barrier services and support to people affected by eating disorders. So as a result of COVID-19, of course, we've had to stop all of our in-person programming. And over the course of a few, I guess the first 2 weeks, we converted as much as we could to online group provisions. So as I mentioned, we typically provide over 20 groups per week. We are now able to provide 11 weekly groups via Zoom for Healthcare, and some of those groups, I can give a few examples. So those include general support groups for young adults and adults. I should say that we support people ages 17 and older, so we do not support children or young teenagers. We also are providing an expressive arts group, a DBT or dialectical behavior therapy skills group, a meal preparation group, trans, non-binary, and gender questioning support group, and more. So our groups remain free. The main differences are that we are unfortunately unable to serve as many people as we were prior. Our groups do have to be a bit smaller, ironically, even though they are online, as I was mentioning before, because it is such a new platform for us. We do need to do this ethically and slowly. And so we are right now able to support just over 100 clients at a time, but typically we're supporting more than 4 times that, and our wait lists are still full. So there's a huge demand. We've also moved our outreach and education initiatives online. So through providing a few of our own webinars and participating in initiatives like this.
So I think I just want to say to the room, point out that what you've heard from Robert and Charlene and Kaitlyn is one of the things that amazes me most about the organizations we support, and that is their nimbleness and agility. These are organizations that are used to working on shoestrings and having to be innovative as a result. And I think that I just wanted to point that out to those on the webinar, because it's amazing to me what you've all been able to do in a very short period of time to stay available to the people that you serve. I guess, Kaitlyn, I would ask this question. You know, there's a big intersection between eating disorders and mental health issues, but how is it now, is that compounded by the pandemic?
Yeah, good question. So eating disorders are classified as a type of mental health challenge, but we do know that the vast majority of people with eating disorders also have another mental health challenge or multiple mental health challenges. So most commonly that would be depression, anxiety, as well as OCD, PTSD, and substance use. So we rarely see an eating disorder in isolation. So in terms of the impacts of COVID and how that all kind of comes together, we are seeing, of course, like others have spoken to, isolation increasing, both symptoms of, depression and anxiety, and then that reinforcing the eating disorder, or, the feeling of loneliness itself can trigger the onset of eating disorder symptoms. Coping with a loss of control as well is a big theme that's coming up with our clients. So feelings of hopelessness or feelings of not being in control in times of uncertainty can cause individuals to exert control over their food or their movement and exercise as a coping mechanism. Challenges related to grocery shopping and meal preparation as well. So this can be very anxiety provoking for a lot of our clients, whether that's, grocery stores not having a lot of foods available that they may be comfortable with or consider safe, fears of contamination, and even a connection to OCD in that sense can be quite hard. And pressures to stockpile food. So that's something that A, isn't economically available to everyone, and B, can be really triggering when it comes to eating disorder symptoms and either pressures to binge eat or to restrict in order to save the food that is available. Substance use is also a lot higher. The rate of substance use is a lot higher among people with eating disorders compared to those without. So as others have mentioned, we're seeing that as well. As well, something that's more not quite unique to eating disorders, but we know that a lot of people with eating disorders do have a compromised immune function. And while there's no research to indicate that those folks are more prone to getting COVID-19, there is a possibility that that could be a factor at play. And I think it's worth mentioning too that certain marginalized populations are more likely to experience eating disorders. So that includes people who identify as LGBTQ+, especially trans and non-binary folks, and also people who experience food insecurity. So those folks were already affected at a higher rate by eating disorders and mental health challenges. And so these groups remain particularly vulnerable at this time.
Who are you worried isn't seeking treatment right now, Kaitlyn?
Yeah, so again, I think this pandemic is exacerbating pre-existing inequities and issues that were already present. People who I'm specifically, worried will not get access to treatment include people who don't have access to the internet or to high-speed internet. So at Sheena's place right now, we're trying to make accommodations. We're trying to help people dial into our meetings if they can't access the internet, but it is a big barrier. As well, people who already face stigma. There's a lot of stigma surrounding, of course, all mental health challenges, but especially eating disorders for certain groups. So we know that people of color and men are less likely to seek support for their eating disorders despite quite high rates. And so I worry that those individuals will be even less likely to seek support right now. Something that is also a big consideration is access to privacy in a confidential space. So especially with group-based support at Sheena's place, we need people to be able to access a completely private space in order to participate in our group support. And so we know that so many people don't have access to that, depending on their living situation. Parents who don't have access to childcare resources anymore, or other people who are living with either roommates or family who don't know about their eating disorder or who they physically cannot remove themselves from to get support. There's also, because of a lot of stereotypes around who is affected by an eating disorder and what an eating disorder looks like, there, at the best of times, is a lot of pressure among our clients when it comes to who is worthy or deserving of treatment and support. And so this idea that someone isn't sick enough to deserve treatment, a lot of those stereotypes are based in weight, and shape and size. And we know that those things actually don't determine how sick someone is with their eating disorder. But those pressures and thoughts remain. And so I worry that because there are already such limited eating disorder resources prior to COVID-19, and the wait lists are extremely long for hospital programs and for community-based support, I worry that now that resources are even more scarce, that those pressures to, or thoughts around not being sick enough will be exacerbated further.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. And maybe I'll get the team to put all of us on the screen together and answer some questions as a group. I guess before I ask any questions, because you've all heard each other speak, are there any reflections anybody has on other folks' comments? Feel free to open up your audio if you have a comment. Charlene.
Yes, I think exactly what was just said about not having access to technology. We can have all kinds of programs and have counselors at the other end of the phone, but if people don't have phones, and in our community, we're finding that there are a number of people that don't have phones, so we're looking to buy phones with prepaid minutes on it, so people can at least talk to somebody, a counselor or a case manager. iPads, laptops, so people can get into Zoom meetings. Again, if they don't have access to technology, all the services we have and resources that we've put together are for naught. And I agree that access to a private space, that's been a big issue because people are in such cramped quarters and they don't have private space.
So I totally agree. I think one of the issues that we're finding at the moment is that we're redefining what essential workers are, but we're also redefining what essential is. And if you haven't got space, if you've got a precarious job, if you haven't got digital equity, access to the internet, but also digital literacy and digital hardware, you can't get things. It's very difficult to get, say, for instance, the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit. If you can get online, it's quick. If you have to wait for hours on the phone, if you have a phone, then it's still slow. So I think that we are starting to see that things, what essential is, and also language. People forget how many people aren't actually literate and don't speak English and French, and so don't know where the services are, don't know how to social distance. So some of our infrastructure, our language infrastructure, our digital infrastructure, our service infrastructure, which now showing, and also our social assistance infrastructure, is now showing that we were under par before COVID-19, and that's led to real problems during this pandemic, and it's things we have to think about in the future.
Robert, a question that came up earlier in chat for you, but I think might be addressed by others, is just the simple, and I don't think so simple, question of loneliness, and whether or not that is coming up through your distress lines, or what that maybe looks like, that we might be more than loneliness.
I think certainly that is a regular feature of calls prior to COVID, is a feeling of loneliness or isolation. And as has been pointed out by a number of other panelists, COVID just exacerbates that issue. It's a regular feature in many calls to distress centers, and you can see why. I mean, for people who were in difficult circumstances prior to COVID, now with the lockdown, people being not able to leave their homes, it creates a very difficult set of circumstances for people who had pre-existing concerns around the ability to connect with people.
I guess for the group connected to this question, another question that's come up is, as we start to even discuss multi-phased kind of re-socialization, reconnection with society, the opening up of the economy, I can imagine, you know, Kwame, you talked about the financial stresses growing, but I could also imagine that the stress of going back out into society is a thing. And so how are any of you have even time to look ahead to that?
If I can speak to that briefly, I know for a lot of our clients, they actually love our online groups, and it's providing more access to people who either have trouble leaving their homes for physical or mental health reasons. And so for us, we will try to keep some of our online groups open, so that is still an option for people who prefer that, while we also open up in person. So I think it'll be a little bit of a balancing act, but this has served as an opportunity to, like you mentioned earlier, make technological advances that, even though they are far from perfect, they are supporting people in new ways.
So oh, sorry, Robert, were you going there?
I was just going to say that I very much agree with Kaitlyn's comments. I think the adaptations to COVID are going to be with us far after COVID is over, and they're going to make our organization stronger as a result.
I totally agree. I like the idea of thinking about what we need. One of the things that I'm worried about is that everybody will be desperate to go back to normal. And for a lot of people, normal wasn't that great. And the question for me is, where do we want to go? What's different? How do we use some of these technological developments we've had, the nimbleness we've had? We've been able to do things in 6 weeks that we've been trying to do for 12 years in the health service. You know, how do we actually start using some of the lessons we've learned, you know, to build a new tomorrow? And also, how do we define what that tomorrow is? I really like the idea of people being more mentally and psychologically literate. I really like the idea of communities being more literate of mental health and workplaces. But I'd really love our policymakers to be thinking about mental health and mental health resilience, and thinking about people when we're thinking about the recovery phase. And not just thinking about sort of how we get the economy moving, but actually thinking about people, how you move, you know, what can we take from this, and how can we build a more resilient community? And we know that we've got these ideas of staying connected, keeping learning, mindfulness, exercise, giving back. We know that on the Indigenous side, we have much deeper ideas of connection and purpose, and other things from the medicine wheel that are really important for people. You know, do we need to think about those when we're thinking about what we want to recreate, where we want to go to? Because I think we can do better.
You know, last week we were, and Charlene, I'm going to let you speak because I think you'll probably have an answer to this too. We were talking about the issues of race and COVID, and we had the head of the Chicago, it was 2 weeks ago, the head of the Chicago Community Foundation talking about race-based data and those issues. But a phrase she used that really caught my attention, and maybe folks on the webinar would think this is jargony, but I actually was totally struck by this idea of focusing on an equitable recovery. And if we can look ahead to that, I feel that's sort of what you're starting to talk about, Kwame, but what does that really look like on the ground for those of you that are really on the front lines? What does an equitable recovery from this possibly look like?
I think the word that comes to me is balance. And I think it's a balance on all aspects of the medicine wheel. I think COVID has really shown us what some real issues are in our society, where the inequity lies, what people need, and how to move forward. And I think we need to take these lessons that we're learning now and move it into the future in a balanced way. I totally agree that we've learned some great things around technology, and we're reaching people now that we weren't able to reach before. We have my therapists tell me that their families are engaging in a much more today than they did before COVID, because they don't have to run across the city. They don't have to find tokens. They don't have to find childcare. They can do it in their home. So if we can have a balanced approach, but if we can also, really think about homelessness. I have a house full of women that I don't know where they're going to go when COVID is over because there's nowhere. The wait list for housing is sky high. Rents, people cannot afford them. So there's a lot of things that I hope that we'll stop and really have a great think tank around how to move forward in a good way.
One of the
Kaitlyn
things.
or Robert,
Oh, sorry,
Kaitlyn.
Kaitlyn.
And go ahead, Kwame.
No,
You go right
Kaitlyn,
ahead, Kwame.
Robert. I think you're probably sharing it out, and I'm talking too much. So Kaitlyn and Robert.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that comes to me, and one of the fault lines I think that we had previously is that we believe that people who are off work or people with mental health problems, it was reasonable to leave them in poverty. And our system of social assistance leaves people in poverty and leaves people precariously in precarious jobs or in precarious housing. And we've seen that if we keep our social assistance and support levels very low, we are very vulnerable. And so if there was something that I would be learning from this is that we actually need to be thinking about how we allow people to thrive, because then they're stronger, because there is going to be another problem down the line. And one of the things that I've been taking from listening to all of the digital solutions is not so much the digital solutions, it's the fact that people are making things more accessible. And we had accessibility problems with support services and treatment services, and we're trying to get around that. But we have volume problems also with support services and treatment, and we need to sort those out. So one of the things that I've seen in my family and other families is people taking a deep breath and saying, what is really important? And I think if our society and our governments and all of us start actually just taking a deep breath and saying, what is really important, then we'll realize that actually equity is important. Actually having people living in poverty isn't what it is to be Canadian. It's not what it is to have a reasonable society. But it also makes us all weaker. Yeah, we're all weaker that way. And so I think the question for me going forward is, what do you really think is important here? Because we've got a little bit of time to be thinking about it. By autumn, we have to be laying the next society, the society we want to be, rather than the society we were.
And can I just add one more thing? I agree that we all are interconnected, but I think the lesson that we also have to take from this is how are we interconnected with the earth and what's happening with the earth right now. And I think that's the silver lining in some of this. People are waking up to realize that we're, we really need to stop and take a look at our waters, at the air quality, at the animals, how we're interacting with each other, how we're interacting with the earth, how we're all interrelated and interconnected. And I agree that we all can be strong together, but we need to come together in some way and move forward. That's all.
If I can add too, I think one outcome that I hope will occur as a result of this is that because so many people are experiencing mental health challenges, I hope that goes on to increase everyone's empathy towards these issues. And I hope that we listen more to those who are facing these challenges. There's so much top-down decision-making that happens, which of course is necessary in certain ways, but I hope that we're able to listen to the people that we all serve. And, in a group last night, I was struck by the resilience and the strength of all of the people in that group. A lot of folks were even saying, like, despite all of the hardship and intersecting inequities that are going on, they feel like they've almost been preparing for this in a sense, in that they've developed the skills to manage anxiety over all of these years. And while things are terrible, they also feel like warriors. I think that was the word that someone used. And so that really just kind of humbled me a lot in knowing that, yes, I have a certain level of expertise as a social worker, but at the end of the day, the people who are going through everything are the true experts, and we need to listen to them as best we can.
Robert, I'll give you the last word before we wrap up. That was perfectly said, all of you, but Robert, no pressure, Robert, but last thoughts. But don't forget to turn your mic on.
Thank you. About a month ago, during the early days of COVID, I was at our Trinity Square location, and this is a time where downtown was absolutely a ghost town. There was no one around. People were staying home. And we were wondering whether we were going to be able to attract volunteers to come in and answer the helplines. And about 5 o'clock that night, 3 young volunteers showed up, and it was a very heartwarming moment to see them come in. And I asked one of the volunteers why he was there, and he said he was there because people need us, and people need our support. And it was quite a moment to see 3 young volunteers who really understood that they are making a difference in the world, and that their work mattered.
Well, your work matters, and we are so very grateful to you all for being with us. It's these are intense times. I find I'm crying a lot more these days, and I'm so Kaitlyn used the word humble. That's how I feel talking to you this morning, and all the work that you're doing. I promise, Kwame, I'm going to take a deep breath and try to work within the framework I have at the Toronto Foundation to ensure that we keep the good that comes through this. And Charlene, absolutely staying connected to our planet and the land. And I thank all of you for giving us your hour today and for the work that you're doing. I have almost completely run out of time, so I'm going to quickly say a few wrap-up items for the group. Thank you for joining us this morning. We will be back in 2 weeks, and our topic is going to be homelessness and precarious housing, which is, of course, deeply intersected with this issue today. I'm very proud of our team who the Better Toronto Coalition Fund is up to 2.7 million. We have distributed more than 60 grants to hardworking organizations like the ones you've met today, doing great work. We're doing it unrestricted. We are not requesting any reporting, and we encourage any funders on this call to do the same. We want to thank Van City Investment Bank, who is the company that seeded this work, this webinar, this coalition, and got this domino started. We wouldn't be able to do any of this without the great people at Van City. And please be sure to open the follow-up email we send you amongst the links that came out of today's conversation. Our latest brief, of course, is on mental health, and I won't kid you, it's not a happy picture, but I think it's critical that we always put data front and center when we're looking at making our case for a better future. So see you all again, I hope, on Thursday, March 14th. If you know others that would like to join us, feel free to share the invitation. This is a webinar that is open to anyone who cares about their community. And I thank you all. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay connected to those you love. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.